Welcome to the Archive of Nations, whom are the custodians of the sacred records from time immemorial. Please subscribe and press the notification button, as we have many lessons to educate and empower with a correct narrative of the past to create a lawful blueprint for the future. Welcome to webisode 14 of the Fallacy of Greece and Rome, entitled African and Phoenician Matriarchal Deities Become Greek Patriarchal Gods. It is advisable that if you have not watched our previous content, that you go back and watch from webisode 1 entitled The Patriarchs of Mount Olympus, as we are providing a linear narrative with each webisode building upon the next. Also, please like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy this content, and hit notifications to get notified of our latest content. And remember, these are materials to point you into a direction of ignored study, therefore confirming for yourself these realities. So grab a paper and pen, take notes, and enjoy. We begin the series with our first webisode entitled The Patriarchs of Mount Olympus, in which we introduce the ancient lands of Greece with its rich carbon organic history and African and Phoenician origins. We opened with the matriarchal Libyo-Ethiopians, also known as Pelasgians, and have shown over the past 14 webisodes that it was these indigenous peoples who bestowed upon this land the name Greece, derived from the Nilotic term Graikoi before the arrival of the hybrid Asian albino Hellenes. The Graikoi, or people of the Grey One, referred to themselves as such because they worshipped the goddess when she embodied the crone phase, marked by wisdom and age. This devotion to the goddess influenced their identity and gave rise to the term Graikoi, later translated as Greeks by the eventual invading Hellenes. As the Pelasgians migrated from Africa to Europe, they transplanted themselves from the mountains of the Moon, a legendary African range, to Argolis, a corresponding region in Greece. Within this webisode, we will continue where we left the previous webisode, which established the carbon organic ancient Egyptian and Phoenician roots of divinity found in Greece and their matriarchal or matrilineal customs and rules of inheritance. Let us begin with Olympus, the home of the Greek gods, and with the ancient sport known as the Olympics, which began as foot races to qualify to become priestesses of the triple goddess. Indeed, later the races turned into deadly combats for the privilege of becoming the consort of the matriarch, the goddess alter ego on earth. The origin of the name Olympos is compounded of ou, lima, and pos, meaning pure foot, in relation to the aforementioned races. Mount Olympus was historically also known as Mount Belus after Iliad 1.591, where the seat of the gods is referred to as heavenly threshold. Belos was the indifferent classical rendering of the Shemitic words Baal, meaning Lord, as a theonym, personal name, and royal title. Baal was a title and honorific meaning owner, Lord in the Northwest Semitic languages spoken in the Levant during antiquity. From its use among people, it came to be applied to gods. Inscriptions have shown that the name Baal was particularly associated with the storm and fertility god. Baal derives from the Phoenician, and the worship of Baal spread to Egypt by the Middle Kingdom and throughout the Mediterranean following the waves of Phoenician colonization in the early 1st millennium BCE. In Greek mythology, Belus was a king of Egypt and father of Aegyptus and Danaus, and brother to Agenor, who ruled over Sidon and Tyre in Phoenicia. Diodorus Siculus claims that Belus also founded a colony on the river Euphrates and appointed the priests astrologers whom the Babylonians call Chaldeans. This Belus is referring to the Babylonian god Marduk as an ancient king who founded Babylon and built the ziggurat. One thing that is clear is that these Greeks traced their origins and their deities back to the southern continent, being ancient Egypt and Libya, and to the east being Mesopotamia. Babylon and Phoenicia and their original pantheon of gods were the ancient deities of the Egyptian Neteru and the ancient Sumerian Anunnaki. Now let's return to the principle of the triple goddess. The triple goddess is a deity or deity archetype revered in many religious and spiritual traditions. In common usage, the triple goddess is viewed as a triunity of three distinct aspects or figures united in one being. These three figures are often described as the maiden, the mother, and the crone, each of which symbolizes both a separate stage in the female life cycle and a phase of the moon, and often rules one of the realms of heavens, earth, and underworld. Although feared as an archetype for millennia, she is the one who reminds us that death is part of the life cycle, just as the moon's dark phase precedes the new moon. The goddess takes a threefold form, known as the triple goddess. Her individual aspects, known as the maiden, the mother, and the crone, are aligned with the phases of the moon's cycle as it orbits the Earth, the waxing crescent, the full moon, and the waning crescent. These aspects also represent the three phases of a woman's life in terms of physical reproduction, before, during, and after the body's ability to have a child. Scholar Maria Gimbutas's theories relating to goddess-centered culture among pre-Indo-European Old Europe, 6500 to 3500 BCE, have been widely adopted by hybrid Asian albino populations of New Age and eco-feminist groups and has been referred to as the grandmother of the goddess movement in the 1990s. Gimbutas postulated that in Old Europe, the Aegean and the Near East, a single great triple goddess was worshipped, predating what she deemed as a patriarchal religion imported by the Kurgan culture, nomadic speakers of Indo-European languages. Also known as the Yamnaya, as discussed in previous webisodes. Gimbutas interpreted iconography from Neolithic and earlier periods of European history, evidence of worship of a triple goddess represented by 1. Stiff nudes, birds of prey or poisonous snakes interpreted as death. 2. Mother figures interpreted as symbols of birth and fertility. 3. Moths, butterflies, or bees, or alternatively a frog, hedgehog, or bull's head symbolizing the uterus or fetus, representing regeneration. As a poet and mythographer, Robert Graves claimed a historical basis for the triple goddess. Graves explained, as goddess of the underworld she was concerned with birth, procreation, and death. As goddess of the earth, she was concerned with the three seasons of spring, summer, and winter. She animated trees and plants and ruled all living creatures. As goddess of the sky, she was the moon, in her three phases of new moon, full moon, and waning moon. As the new moon or spring, she was a girl. As the full moon or summer, she was woman. As the old moon or winter, she was hag. A figure he used from outside of Greek myth was of the Ghanaian tribe known as the Akan triple moon goddess Game, who Graves said was still worshipped in 1960. The Akan people are believed to have migrated from smaller kingdoms in the western Sudan region to their current location around the 11th century. In their oral teaching, they claim to have originated in the Levant region of Canaan, hence Akan, and passed through Egypt on their migration. Akan means first, foremost, indicating the enlightened and civilized, and are traditionally matrilineal. In the anthology The Greek Myths, 1955, Graves posited that Greece had been settled by a matriarchal goddess-worshipping people before being invaded by successive waves of patriarchal Indo-European speakers from the north. Much of Greek myth, in his view, recorded the consequent religious, political, and social accommodations until the final triumph of patriarchy. Karenii wrote in 1952 that several Greek goddesses were triple moon goddesses of the maiden mother crone type, including Hera and others. For example, Karenii writes, with Hera the correspondences of the mythological and cosmic transformation extended to all three phases in which the Greeks saw the moon. She corresponded to the waxing moon as maiden, to the full moon as fulfilled wife, to the waning moon as abandoned, withdrawing women. He goes on to say that trios of sister goddess in Greek myth refer to the lunar cycle. In the book in question, he treats Athene also as a triple moon goddess, noting the statement by Aristotle that Athene was the moon, but not only the moon. Archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans, who in excavating Knossos in Crete had come to the view that prehistoric Cretans had worshipped a single mighty goddess at once virgin and mother. According to Robert Graves, Hecate was the original and most predominant ancient triple moon goddess. Hecate was represented in triple form from the early days of her worship. A strong possibility for the foreign origin of the name may be Hecate, Qt, a frog-headed Egyptian goddess of fertility and childbirth, who, like Hecate, was also associated with ruler. The word Heka in the Egyptian language is also both the word for magic and the name of the god of magic and medicine, Heka. Thus, Robert Graves, in his book The Greek Myths, he writes that Mount Olympus was the home of Eurynomy and Ophion. These two deities were the respective creator goddess herself and her serpentine demiurge of the matriarchal Libyo-Ethiopians, otherwise known as Pelasgians, Danans, and Cadmeans, the autochthons of that southeastern European country. Apollonius' story of the fall of Eurynomy and Ophion was derived from the Orphic cosmogonies. According to the Orphics, creation began with hydros, the primordial water, from which Gaia the earth arose, which matches both scientific and biblical accounts. In the Greek legends, as with many female deities, she became a he and was depicted with a serpentine, Ophion, fishtail in place of legs and holding a snake, Ophis, in his hands. One strategy of the patriarchal mythographers was to cause all the goddesses and their male exponents like Dionysus and Apollo to be mythically reborn from Zeus' own body to enable the Hellenic patriarchs to claim that these were all children and, therefore, also subordinates of Zeus. Attempts were made to mildew their brains by some other method so that they now always supported patriarchal causes, attitudes, and teachings. I am all for the father. The goddess Athene herself, hitherto the unchallenged judge, grovels during some debate soon after her rebirth from the brow of Zeus. To make assurance double sure, there was a permanent male casting of vote in the Olympian council so that male victory was now automatic after every debate. Western tutelage is familiar with Hera, Io, Athene, and Artemis, all of them names of one and the same goddess, and with Apollo, Dionysus, and such other originally Nilotic deities, but only in their reborn or subdued Hellenic status. Europe knows them only after they have been transformed into entities completely subservient to the machistic assumptions, schemes, and deeds of Zeus of the Hellenes and his male satellites. In the internet today, every Western blogger describes Athene as a daughter of Zeus. Graves' statement also raises an inevitable question. Where exactly was the Olympus of Eurynomy, the universal ruler, and Ophion, the serpent? Everybody, including even Robert Temple, in The Serious Mystery, assumes that it stood exactly where Hellenic Olympus stands, beyond Thessaly. Yet the autochthonous Greeks called Omphalos, their socio-religious umbilical cord, did not lie anywhere north of the intrusive Gulf of Corinth. It did not lie even in sacred Boeotia and Attica. It laid, rather, in Arcadia, the heart of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, decidedly south of the Gulf. Arcadia's supreme emotional significance lies in that it was the place where the native Greeks were holed up when the Hellenes poured into their country. All this strongly suggests that, in pre-Hellenic times, Olympus was the Pelasgic name for a Peloponnesian eminence, and that this same name was given by the related Cadmeans to the mountain beyond Thessaly, but that, with the triumph of the Hellenes, the name became confined by decree to this northern eminence. It suggests that the Arcadian significance of Olympus declined and was forgotten. Indeed, on certain maps of ancient Greece, including one printed by Graves, we find a place called Olympia, and, significantly, it is situated on the southern shores of the Gulf, in the Peloponnesian kingdom of Elis, a district of Arcadia of extraordinary holiness to the Greeks of African pedigree, the Pelasgians. Indeed, Graves tells us specifically that the Olympic Games were named after this Arcadian Olympia, and not after the Thessalo-Magnesian Olympus. He writes, some say that males, the Cuorites, protected Zeus's cradle in Crete, and that they afterwards came to Elis and raised a temple to propitiate Cronus. The problem is that even a man as knowledgeable as Graves lumps the Pelasgo-Cadmean story of creation with every other that has come to us through such Hellenic mythography as the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Theogony, and calls them the Greek myths. This title is dangerously misleading because it may reaffirm the false assumption that the word Greek necessarily refers to the Hellenes, the modern inhabitants of Greece. Yet, although we know these stories only through the pens of such committed Hellenists, very few of the stories were actually Greek or in any sense Hellenic. Only after the Hellenic invasion of Greece in the latter half of the 2nd millennium BC was Hellenism infused into what are actually Pelasgic originals. The Hellenists systematically retold those stories in order to smuggle Zeus into them as the central character. But the stories were already spread much wider than the Greek world. Greece of the Danaans was definitely a part of the stage, which Homer and Hesiod capture. But it was peripheral. Hesiod's Greek world included what are now Kenya, India, Russia, Denmark, Britain, Morocco, and Congo, and all the countries inside that circle, with Kush, Egypt, Libya, Crete, Canaan, and Sumeria as its numinous epicenter. Any slight examination shows that the theater sprawled as far as between the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, and the Irrawaddy on the one side, and the Shannon, the Senegal, and the Congo on the other, and from the Cape of Good Hope to Lapland. For example, the Erinyes, or Fates, who represented the goddess's spirit returning in her triad to torment the consciences of the patriarchal matricides, were headquartered in Azan or Azania in what are now Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. In short, the drama that we call Greek mythology was enacted in places as far from one another as Cipango, Melanesia, Madagascar, Mexico, Canada, and Iceland. Shakespeare was right. To the ancients, the entire world was a stage. When the ancient Egyptians spoke of the South as the abode of both their ancestors and their deities, they could hardly have meant Greece or Rome or Palestine, countries which were decidedly to the north of them. Quite simply, then, the Pelasgian home of creation by Eurynomy and Ophion could not have been anywhere north of the Mediterranean Sea. Many researchers, including Graves, Temple, and O'Mowell, would identify the Ruwenzori as the original Olympus, the template of all the other steeple-peaked divine abodes throughout the world, including the Sinaitic Horeb, the Japanese Fujiyama, the Tibetan Meru Andes of the Incas. The Hellenes then borrowed from the Pelasgians a minor god called Dio, who is Zeus, and imposed him as the tyrant of Olympus, bestriding the narrow world like a colossus to rape Pelasgic females and destroy their shrines through a deadly electric thunderbolt which he had stolen from goddess Demeter. In fact, Zeus had been merely a sacred king, the royal consort of the queen, always playing second fiddle to her, enjoying only as much power as Prince Philip, England's Duke of Edinburgh. Before the Hellenic advent, Zeus had acted merely as the principal, but not the only, means of reproducing the heir to the throne. As a matter of religious necessity, when his sell-by date had come, the sacred king was sacrificed remorselessly on the altar of his Tanist, a younger pretender to the queen's bed. This pre-Hellenic practice was, indeed, the origin of the Nemean Games, Isthmic Games, and what came to be called Olympic Games. In pre-Hellenic times, foot races were run in Thebes, Memphis, and other centers throughout the Nile Valley, from Ginja to the Delta, exclusively by girls to compete for the position of high priestess of the triple goddess. The Olympic Games, Graves informs us, originated in a foot race, run by girls, for the privilege of becoming the priestess of the moon goddess Hera, and since this event took place in the month of Parthenios, of the maiden, it seems to have been annual. When Zeus married Hera, when, that is, a new form of sacred kingship had been introduced into Greece by the Hellenic Achaeans. A second foot race was run by young men for the dangerous privilege of becoming the priestess's consort, son to her moon, and thus king of Elis. The month of Parthenios is named after Parthenos, the Hellenic word which, like Isaiah's Alma, has been mistranslated as virgin, but which means simply a woman who has reached the birth-giving age. However, the point Graves is making, concerning the month of Parthenios, is that the race was originally annual and became a 4-year event only later. Here Graves tells us that a second foot race was run by young men. But for what? The answer, for the dangerous privilege of becoming the priestess's consort. In other words, the adjective second in Graves' statement refers not to the order of events on a particular sporting occasion, but to institutional or socio-systemic succession. The second kind of race began as an overlap with the first and then, with the triumph of patriarchy, eventually completely replaced it. The first race had been confined to girls for the privilege of serving the goddess in her shrine. The second race was now run by boys for the privilege of serving as the queen's bedfellow, the alter ego of the demiurge. The Hellenes from the Balkan Peninsula, erroneously referred to as Greeks, are unanimous in recognizing the birthplace of Zeus as Crete. The carbon organic Minoan culture contributed many essentials of the ancient Hellas religion. By 100 channels the old civilization emptied itself into the new. The carbon organic Cretan Zeus retained his youthful Minoan features. The local child of the Great Mother, a small and inferior deity who took the roles of son and consort, whose Minoan name the Hellenes Hellenized as Velchanos, was in time assumed as an epithet by Zeus, as transpired at many other sites, and he came to be venerated in Crete as Zeus Velchanos, meaning boy Zeus, often simply the Kouros. The dio prefix in ancient Greek has been associated since antiquity with Zeus, and the variants of the name seem to point to an original asterisk Dionysos. The earliest attestation is the Mycenaean Greek dative form, Dionyso, featured on 2 tablets that had been found at Mycenaean Pylus and dated to the 12th or 13th century BC. Dio stems from Proto-Indo-Iranian and the Proto-Indo-European daylight sky god Dius, and is cognate with the Greek Zeus Pater, or Latin Jupiter, from an earlier Jaus Pater, stemming from the daylight sky father. The noun Diaush, when used without the pit father, refers to the daylight sky and occurs frequently in the Rig Veda as an entity. Diau Pit appears in hymns with Prithvi Mata Mother Earth in the ancient Vedic scriptures of Hinduism. Diau's most defining trait is his paternal role. In Crete, Zeus was worshipped at a number of caves at Knossos, Ida, and Palikastro. In the Hellenistic period, a small sanctuary dedicated to Zeus Vilchanos was founded at the Hagia Triada, meaning Holy Trinity, and is the archaeological site of an ancient Minoan settlement site of a long-ruined Minoan palace. Broadly contemporary coins from Phaistos show the form under which he was worshipped. A youth sits among the branches of a tree, with a cockerel on his knees. On other Cretan coins, Vilchanos is represented as an eagle and in association with a goddess celebrating a mystic marriage. On Crete, Zeus was represented in art as a long-haired youth rather than a mature adult, and hymned as Homegas Kouros, the great youth. Thessaly became the divine headquarters of the Hellenic pantheon only in the latter half of the 2nd millennium BC, after the Hellenes had overrun the country to overthrow the African goddess from her perch. At Olympia, where, in historic days, Zeus ruled supreme, Hera had her ancient separate sanctuary, the Heraeon, the building of which long predated that of Zeus. At Argos, too, there was an ancient Heraeon sacred to the ox-eyed goddess. In Thessaly, in the ancient Argonautic legend, Hera is queen and patron of the hero Jason. Of Zeus we hear nothing. What does it all mean? The answer is clear enough. Hera has been forcibly married. She is an ancient Pelasgian divinity, and when Zeus, the god of the immigrant Achaeans, conquers her land, he marries the native princess. But she is never really subject to him. She leaves a wife's submission to the shadowy double of Zeus, Dion. In a word, the unseemly squabblings between Zeus and Hera are the outcome, not of conjugal jealousy, but of racial rivalry. Hera remains always the turbulent, native princess, coerced, but never really subdued by the alien conqueror. Hera, then, was queen in Greece long before the coming of the Achaean Zeus. In those early Pelasgian days, who and what was she? Hera is the spirit of the year, the daimon who brings the fruits of the year in their season. As such, she has a threefold seasonal aspect. At Stymphalos, in remote Arcadia, Pausanias tells us Hera had 3 sanctuaries and 3 surnames. While yet a girl, she was called child or maiden. When married, she was called full-grown, and, separated from her husband, she was called Chera, the desolate one, the widow. She reflects, then, the 3 stages of a woman's life, but she reflects also the 3 seasons, for in antiquity the seasons were 3, not 4, spring, summer, winter, summer and autumn being regarded together as one season of fruit-bearing. In the spring she is child or maiden, in summer and autumn she is full-grown, and in winter she is a widow. It's well documented that classical Greek thinkers traveled to what we now call Egypt to expand their knowledge. When the Greek scholars Thales, Hippocrates, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, and others traveled to ancient Egypt, also known as Kemet, they studied at the temple universities Wazit and Ipet-Isit. Here, the Hellenes were inducted into a wide curriculum that encompassed both the esoteric as well as the practical. Thales was the first to go to Kemet. He was introduced to the ancient Egyptian mystery system, which is the knowledge that formed the basis of the ancient Egyptians' understanding of the world, which had been developed over the previous 4,500 years. After he returned, Thales made a name for himself by accurately predicting a solar eclipse and demonstrating how to measure the distance of a ship at sea. He encouraged others to make their way to Kemet to study. In Kemet, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, learned of disease from the previous explorations of Imhotep, who established diagnostic medicine 2,500 years earlier. This early Renaissance man priest, astronomer, and physician was described as the first figure of a physician to stand out clearly in the mists of antiquity by the British medical trailblazer William Osler. In Kemet, Pythagoras, the father of mathematics, learned calculus and geometry from the Kemetic priests based on a millennia-old papyrus. Egypt was the cradle of mathematics, Aristotle wrote. The Kemetic education was meant to last 40 years, although no Greek thinker is known to have made it through the entire process. Pythagoras is believed to have made it the furthest, having studied in Kemet for 23 years. Plato's education may have expressed it best. The Kemetic mystery system was based upon a wide array of human knowledge. It encompassed math, writing, physical science, religion, and the supernatural, requiring tutors to be both priests and scholars. Perhaps the aspect of the system that best represents this merger of religion and science is Mot. Mot was a goddess who embodied the concept of the rational order to the universe. This idea that the universe is rational passed from the Egyptians to the Greeks, writes historian Richard Hooker. The Greeks' name for this concept was logos. In his Republic, Plato describes the dichotomy between a higher and lower self. The higher self being pursues knowledge, reason, and discipline. The lower self, the more prominent of the two, is base, concerned with more crude aspects like sex, addiction, and other self-serving pursuits. Reason must ultimately win over emotion for a life to be worthwhile. Thus the emphasis of reason over all else was born, and the concepts of spirituality and reason began to diverge. To the Kemites, the physical and the spiritual were intertwined. The concept of Ma'at was as important as geometry. But after the Hellenes formed their interpretation, reason eventually edged out spirituality, and this view of existence was passed down. Plato, who was among the first to extol the advantages of reason over emotion in his Republic, inspired the 17th century philosopher René Descartes. Descartes' observations concerning reason inspired the modern scientific method, which has fueled a strictly rational inquiry of our existence. While Europe and the rest of the West readily credit ancient Greece as its foundation, this credit isn't extended to carbon organic founders from Africa and carbon organic Asia. During the 19th century, many European writers, limited by ethnocentrism and racism, decided that Black Africa could have had nothing to do with Europe's rise to greatness, writes Gloria Dickinson, professor of African American Studies at the College of New Jersey. At a time when the hybrid Asian albinos usurpers of Western society was recreating itself after the cataclysms, wars, and exterminations that had destroyed and removed carbon organic tribes, clans, and families from Europe, the hybrid Asian albino Europeans were hardly going to credit the carbon organic tribes, families, and clans of building the foundation of that very same society. Join us on the next episode as we continue to unravel the mysteries of our past to create a better blueprint for the future for all fallen humanity. This series, The Claim of Thrones, will take you on a journey through the universe, across the galactic heavens to the eventual seeding of the planet Earth. This series will also cover the hidden realities of how humanity came about, the various cataclysms and restarts, and follow the various bloodlines of indigenous rights of inheritance. This narrative sets the sacred record straight in regards to who's who on the planet Earth and begins the journey of the lawful reversion and restitution for the heirs of Mother Earth. If you like this content, please subscribe and hit the notification button, as well as support across our many social media platforms.